Ladies and gentlemen, let me talk to you for a minute because there comes a moment in every relationship where the noise stops, the texts slow down, the calls disappear, and suddenly both of y'all are silent. No good mornings, no good nights, just quiet. And everybody in here knows silence is loud. Ladies and gentlemen, let me slow this thing down and talk to you real plain for a minute because silence in a relationship is one of the most misunderstood things on this planet. Folks think silence means nothing is happening. They think silence means space. They think silence means calm. But let me tell you something I've learned through living, loving, failing, and learning again. Silence is communication without words. It is not empty. It is full of thoughts, full of assumptions, full of emotions that haven't found the courage to come out loud yet. See, when somebody stops talking to you, they didn't stop feeling. Feelings don't just clock out. When the phone stops ringing and the messages stop coming, the mind gets louder. Every memory comes back. Every argument replays. Maybe I should have said this, starts circling your head at 2 in the morning. Silence is not the absence of emotion. It's emotion with nowhere to go. Now, here's where people mess up. They assume silence is accidental, like it just happened. No. Silence is a decision. Somebody chose not to speak. Somebody chose not to explain. Somebody chose not to reach out. Even if that choice came from hurt or confusion, it was still a choice. And when both people make that choice at the same time, now you've got two stories being written in two different heads with no shared truth. A woman might go silent because she's tired of repeating herself. She's already said how she feels. She's already explained what hurt her. In her mind, silence means, I've done my part. If he cares, he'll step up. But a man might go silent because he feels overwhelmed or challenged. In his mind, silence means, let me back up before I say something wrong, or sometimes, let me see if she'll miss me. Same silence, two completely different meanings. That's why silence is dangerous, because you're not responding to what the other person is actually thinking. You're responding to what you assume they're thinking. And assumptions are relationship killers. Silence communicates things people are afraid to say out loud. It says, I'm hurt. It says, I don't feel heard. It says, I'm protecting myself. It also sometimes says, I'm pulling away. And the scary part is, nobody announces which one it is. You're left to guess. And when people guess, they usually guess wrong. Silence can feel powerful, especially when emotions are high. It feels like control. It feels like strength. It feels like I'm not going to be the one to chase. But what people don't realize is that prolonged silence slowly turns into emotional distance. And emotional distance is harder to close than physical distance. You can be sitting right next to somebody and feel 1,000 miles apart if silence has been living between you too long. And let me tell you something else that's real uncomfortable. Silence reveals priorities. If days go by and nobody checks in, nobody clarifies, nobody says, hey, this matters to me, that silence is speaking louder than any argument ever could. Not because there's no love, but because there may not be enough urgency. And relationships don't survive without urgency. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes silence is necessary. Sometimes people need space to cool down, to think, to avoid saying something they can't take back. That kind of silence has intention behind it. But silence without communication about the silence, that's where trouble lives. Because one person is thinking, we're just taking space, while the other is thinking, I'm being abandoned. Same quiet, two emotional realities. And here's the part most folks don't want to hear. Silence doesn't stop conflict. It delays it. Whatever wasn't said will eventually come out, either through words, actions, or walking away. Unspoken feelings don't disappear. They harden. They turn into resentment. And resentment doesn't knock on the door. It moves in quietly, just like silence did. When you're silent, you're teaching the other person how to treat you. You're showing them what you'll tolerate, what you'll avoid, and how much emotional effort you're willing to give. And if silence becomes the default response to problems, the relationship becomes a GU, sing game instead of a partnership. The strongest relationships aren't built on silence. They're built on clarity, on uncomfortable conversations, on people saying, this is how I feel, even if my voice shakes. Silence might feel safer in the moment, but honesty is what keeps love alive long term. So when you notice the silence creeping in, don't pretend it's nothing. Don't romanticize it. Don't weaponize it. Pay attention to it. Because silence is always saying something, always. And the question isn't whether it's communicating. The question is whether it's communicating what you actually want the other person to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, let me take you deeper into this thing, because when both people go silent, what you're really watching is not a breakup yet. It's a transformation in motion. Silence is the space where emotions either mature or turn toxic. It's the waiting room of a relationship, and nobody knows if they're about to be healed or sent home. When the talking tops, the ego usually steps in and takes the microphone. That's when pride starts whispering things like, "Don't text first, don't look weak. If they cared, they'd call." And before you know it, two people who still care deeply are sitting on opposite sides of the same wall, both hurting, both waiting, both refusing to move first. Silence doesn't remove emotion, it just hands control over to pride. Here's what's really happening during that quiet period. Both people are replaying the last conversation in their head, trying to decide who was more wrong and who deserves the apology. Instead of focusing on the relationship, they're focused on winning. And the moment winning becomes more important than understanding, the relationship starts losing. A lot of folks think whoever breaks the silence loses power. They think speaking first means you care more, but that's backwards. Speaking with honesty takes strength. Staying silent out of fear takes effort, but it doesn't take courage. Courage is risking rejection for the sake of clarity. Courage is saying, "This matters to me, even if I don't know where we stand." Silence also tests emotional maturity. An emotionally mature person doesn't disappear and call it space. They communicate the need for space. They say, "I need a little time to process, but I'm not going anywhere." That one sentence can save weeks of anxiety and overthinking. Immature silence, on the other hand, leaves the other person guessing, doubting themselves, questioning the entire connection. When both people go silent without boundaries, anxiety fills the gap. One person starts checking their phone too much. The other starts convincing themselves they don't care as much as they actually do. And slowly, self-protection turns into emotional withdrawal. That's how people drift apart without ever having a real ending. And let me say this, silence has a way of magnifying fears. If someone already struggles with trust, silence feels like confirmation of abandonment. If someone struggles with vulnerability, silence feels safer than risking exposure. So both people retreat into their emotional corners, protecting wounds the other person may not even know exist. There's also something else silence reveals: the power dynamic. Whoever cares less usually feels more comfortable staying quiet. Not because they're stronger, but because they have less to lose emotionally. That's why prolonged silence can become unfair. One person is hurting more, thinking more, losing sleep, while the other is fine with the distance. And that imbalance doesn't stay hidden forever. Silence forces you to confront the truth about your connection. If nobody reaches out, it may mean the relationship was running more on routine than intention. If the silence feels peaceful instead of painful, that's information. If the silence makes you realize you were carrying most of the emotional weight, that's clarity you can't ignore. What people don't understand is that sigh. It always leads to a moment of truth. Either someone breaks it with accountability, not excuses, or the silence stretches so long that emotional attachment fades. Feelings don't disappear suddenly. They fade quietly when they're not nurtured. And when silence finally breaks, how it breaks matters. If it breaks with blame, the silence will return. If it breaks with honesty and responsibility, it can reset the entire relationship. But if it breaks casually, like nothing happened, that teaches both people to ignore unresolved issues and repeat the cycle again later. Silence is a mirror. It reflects how people handle discomfort, conflict, and emotional responsibility. Some use it to grow, some use it to hide, and some lose good people because they waited too long to speak. At the end of the day, silence isn't about who texts first. It's about who's willing to show up emotionally when things get uncomfortable. Because love doesn't survive on quiet standoffs. It survives on truth, courage, and the willingness to risk being misunderstood in order to be understood. Ladies and gentlemen, let me talk to you about what really gets exposed when the silence stretches on. Because when nobody is talking, power becomes the loudest thing in the room. And most people don't even realize they're playing a power game. They just know they don't want to be the one who looks weaker, more emotional, or more invested. But silence has a way of shining a spotlight on who holds emotional control and who is quietly carrying the weight. When both people stop communicating, everybody starts watching the clock, not the relationship. Who's going to text first? Who's going to call? Who's going to break? And right there, the focus shifts from love to leverage. Instead of asking, how do we fix this? People start asking, who needs who more? And that question alone can change the entire dynamic. A lot of folks believe the person who stays silent the longest is the strongest. They think restraint. NT equals power. But what they don't understand is that silence doesn't always come from confidence. Sometimes it comes from emotional distance. Sometimes it comes from being okay with losing the connection. And sometimes it comes from knowing the other person is hurting more and waiting them out. That's not strength, that's imbalance. The person who breaks the silence usually isn't weak. They're usually the one who values the connection more in that moment. They're the one who feels the tension, the uncertainty, the unfinished business. And yes, caring more does make you vulnerable. But vulnerability isn't the same thing as losing power. Vulnerability is how truth enters the conversation. Silence keeps truth locked out. Now here's the hard part. When one person consistently breaks the silence and the other one consistently waits, a pattern forms. One becomes the emotional pursuer. The other becomes the emotional gatekeeper. And once that pattern sets in, respect starts slipping with anyone noticing it at first. The pursuer starts feeling unappreciated. The gatekeeper starts feeling entitled. And neither of them are saying it out loud. Silence also reveals emotional availability. Someone who can sit comfortably in silence without checking in may not be as emotionally invested as they once were. Not always, but often. Because when you truly care, the quiet feels heavy. It feels unfinished. It feels wrong. If the silence feels easy, that's information. And ignoring that information doesn't protect you. It delays the truth. People also underestimate how silence shifts control over time. In the beginning, staying quiet might feel like you're holding your ground. But as days pass, emotional attachment doesn't stay frozen. It changes. Either it grows anxious or it grows detached. And detachment is dangerous because once someone emotionally detaches, they don't come back the same. Even if communication resumes, breaking the silence doesn't automatically mean chasing. Depends on how you do it. There's a difference between reaching out with clarity and reaching out with desperation. One says, I value us and I want understanding. The other says, I'm afraid to lose you at any cost. The tone, the intention, and the self-respect behind the message matter more than the message itself. And let me be real with you. Some people use silence as a test. They want to see how long it takes for the other person to crack. They want reassurance without asking for it. They want validation without vulnerability. But testing someone's feelings through silence is risky because tests don't always get the results you expect. Sometimes the other person doesn't respond, not because they don't care, but because they're tired of being tested. Silence can also flip power unexpectedly. The person you thought would chase might choose peace instead. The one you assumed would reach out might decide they've done enough. And when that happens, the power dynamic shifts fast. One who was waiting suddenly feels the loss, and by then it might be too late to fix what silence slowly broke. Another truth people avoid is this: whoever has less emotional clarity during silence feels less powerful, regardless of who texts first. If you're sitting in confusion, anxiety, and self-doubt while the other person seems calm, that imbalance is already costing you emotionally. Power isn't about who speaks last. It's about who feels secure. Silence will always force a decision, even if it's not spoken. Someone eventually decides to reach out, to pull away, or to move on internally. And once that internal decision is made, words become less effective. That's why waiting too long to break the silence can permanently change how someone feels, even if the relationship continues. Healthy power in a relationship doesn't come from silence. It comes from mutual courage, from two people willing to risk discomfort to protect connection. When silence is used to control, manipulate, or avoid, it erodes trust. When silence is used intentionally and communicated clearly, it creates space for growth. So when you find yourself in that quiet standoff, don't just ask who's going to speak first. Ask what staying silent is really costing you. Ask whether you're protecting your pride or protecting the relationship. Because silence always shifts power, but it doesn't always shift it in your favor. Ladies and gentlemen, let me break this down for you, because silence in a relationship doesn't just sit there quietly. It always leads to a moment of truth. And when both people go silent, whether they realize it or not, they are standing at a crossroads. Silence is not neutral. It forces a decision. It forces a revelation. It forces clarity. And the reality is, the moment the silence is broken or the moment it continues too long, you'll find out who truly values the connection and who only values their comfort. When both of you go quiet, the first thing that happens is the truth begins to reveal itself. You start noticing things you may have ignored when the noise and the chaos of everyday conversation were covering them up. You notice how much you actually miss the other person or how little their absence really affects you. You notice how often you think about them or how quickly your mind moves on to other things. Silence is like a mirror. It shows you exactly what's real and what's performative. And sometimes that reflection isn't pretty. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, but it's honest. And let's be clear, breaking silence is never just about sending a message or calling. Breaking silence is a choice to put authenticity above ego. It's saying, this connection matters more than my fear of looking vulnerable. That's why so many relationships fail during silent periods. People are waiting for the other person to reach out, believing that speaking first is a sign of weakness. But the irony is that silence doesn't make you strong. It just delays the inevitable truth. You're not protecting yourself, you're postponing the pain that honesty would solve immediately. During silence, every thought, every feeling, and every insecurity gets amplified. If you're thinking about the relationship in terms of winning or losing, silence will feel unbearable. Your mind will invent scenarios, replay arguments, and exaggerate small things into crises. And while that's happening, the other person is likely doing the exact same thing. So instead of the silence being a neutral pause, it becomes a breeding ground for assumptions, misunderstandings, and unspoken judgments. And the longer it lasts, the more emotional weight piles up on both sides. Now, here's the real test. When silence stretches long enough, it separates those who are emotionally courageous from those who are emotionally comfortable. Emotional courage is when someone is willing to risk looking weak to clarify things, to express their feelings, and to take responsibility for their part. Emotional comfort is when someone chooses quiet because it's easier, because it's safer, because it keeps them from dealing with discomfort. And relationships cannot thrive when one person is courageous and the other is comfortable. Courage is what rebuilds bridges. Comfort is what leaves them to rot. Silence also exposes priorities in a relationship. It shows who truly values connection and who values convenience. Because when no one is talking, actions or inaction speak louder than any words ever could. Does one person make the effort to check in, to reach out, to clarify, or do both wait, letting days turn into weeks? Silence reveals investment. And the truth is, whoever values the relationship most will be the one who struggles with that quiet the hardest. They feel the weight, the tension, the uncertainty, and if their efforts to break the silence are ignored, the emotional burden grows heavier by the day. And here's something many people overlook. Silence doesn't just affect the relationship. It affects you mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Your mind starts running through every what-if scenario, second-guessing everything you said, everything you did, everything you didn't do. Physically, your body feels it too. Stress rises, sleep suffers, and even your self-confidence starts to erode. Silence has a way of infiltrating every part of your life because it's never just a gap in conversation. It's a gap in connection, in understanding, and in closure. Breaking the silence requires honesty, timing, and self-respect. You can't just send a casual hey and expect everything to reset. You have to communicate from a place of clarity. You have to speak what's real, not what you think the other person wants to hear. You have to be willing to address discomfort head on without hiding behind excuses or blame. That's the only way silence can be transformed from a dangerous void into a productive space for growth. And if silence continues without resolution, it doesn't just linger, it changes things. People begin to emotionally detach. They start protecting themselves from disappointment rather than protecting the connection. They begin to question if the relationship is worth the effort. And once detachment sets in, it's almost impossible to reverse. By that point, the silence has done its work, whether intentional or not. It has forced a decision. It has revealed priorities. It has exposed truths that words alone might have concealed. Silence also teaches a hard lesson. Love alone is not enough. Care alone is not enough. Action and courage are required, because when both of you go quiet, the relationship doesn't pause. It either strengthens under the pressure or it starts cracking. Those cracks may not be visible at first, but they are forming with every unspoken thought, every withheld word, every unanswered question. And when silence is finally broken, it's either a chance to rebuild something stronger or a moment that confirms what was already breaking beneath the surface. So when you find yourself in a silent standoff, don't just wait and hope. Don't assume the other person feels the same way or knows how much you care. Use the silence as a lens to see clearly. Ask yourself, what do I really want? What am I willing to risk to get it? And when you do decide to speak, speak with honesty, with courage, and with self-respect. Because silence doesn't decide the future of a relationship, how you respond to it does. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is when the truth comes out, when clarity arrives, and when either connection or closure finally shows its face.